Yeah, the floor is yours then.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So, my aim today in this talk is so my title is The Cognitive Pragmatic Account of the Imagined Audience, Perspectives from Relevance Theory. And my aim is to take this notion of the imagined audience, which we find a lot in media studies and more recently in online communication discussions, to take this idea of an imagined audience and interpret that idea within relevance theory and hopefully integrate it into a relevance theoretic approach to utterance interpretation. And what I'm talking about today is the seeds of an idea that I will be exploring over the next year and a half as part of a Leverhulme Research Fellowship. So the thinking on this is not complete by any means. These are the kind of the first steps towards developing this particular project. So in media studies, we have this idea that when somebody presents something on television or on radio or in journalism, and also when people post online in digitally mediated communication, that they are communicating to an imagined audience. They can't know that audience, they have to imagine who they are. So, as Marwick and Boyd point out, we need this. We need a more specific concept of audience than just anyone if we're going to choose the language, cultural references, style, and so on. So, that is when we're communicating online, we have to have some idea of who we're talking to. Otherwise, we can't make those appropriate decisions. We can't choose the right words, the right references, and so on. And the idea they claim is that this is the imagined audience. And they go on to define that imagined audience as an imagined group of readers who may not actually read the online posts, but they're imagining, they're trying to almost guess who out there is going to read what they're writing or speaking. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to interrogate this idea from a relevance theory perspective, and I'm going to try to argue the following points. So first, and perhaps most controversially, I'm going to argue that from a pragmatics perspective, so-called imagined audiences are not, in fact, either imagined nor really best described as audiences. Now, I mean, these are kind of semantic arguments, and to make that point, we'll obviously have to think a little bit more about what those words mean, but I think it's helpful to unpack and make some distinctions when we're using those words. What do we actually mean by, or what do the media studies people mean when they say imagined, and how are they thinking about their audience? Then I'm going to go on to argue that communicators in online discourse contexts do not imagine their audience any more than communicators in offline or one-to-one contexts do. That if we say they're imagined, then that concept carries over into other discourse contexts as well. And then I will move on to argue that imagining an audience does play a part in online communication in a meaningful sense. I'll get into that in a moment. But actually, it's something that members of the audience do rather than something that communicators do. And that this comes out of relevance theory as a hearer-oriented framework for utterance interpretation. Okay, so my first objective is to kind of pull apart and interrogate this idea of imagining, what might that look like in a relevance theory picture, and this idea of audiences. And so first I want to make a distinction here between addressees and audiences. So for the purpose of this discussion, addressees are the individuals to whom the ostensive act is directed. So if an ostensive act is directed at you, then you are an addressee and you should, and in fact you must use the presumption of optimal relevance in your interpretation. Relevance theory, as we know, is a hearer-oriented pragmatic framework. And if we go back to the presumption of optimal relevance, that first clause says the ostensive stimulus is relevant enough for it to be worth the addressee's effort to process it. So addressees have a special, a privileged position in this framework. They are the people who can presume optimal relevance. However, the audience for a piece of broadcast communication or online communication, or in fact many other types of communication, often includes a whole lot of other people who may come across that message, who aren't specifically targeted by it. They aren't specific addressees of it. So they're part of the audience, but they're not addressees. And I think we need that distinction. So we have the audience, who is the set of individuals who watch, listen to, or read a piece of communication, and a subset of those will be addressees. But there will be people amongst that audience who are processing an utterance that is not actually directed, addressed to them. And I think we need this distinction from a relevance theory perspective, because the addressees matter in relevance theory because of that privileged position. Um, from a relevance theoretic pragmatic perspective, it's the addressees that matter. And those other people milling around in the audience don't really tell us anything about how the utterance should be interpreted, or what the intended interpretation of the utterance might be taken to be. Now, you might well be thinking, well, okay, addressees in the terms that I'm using here, that's just the intended audience or the imagined audience. And perhaps I'm just using addressee as a shorthand for imagined audience or intended audience, in kind of in contrast to the actual or potential audience. But I think whatever terminology we use, we need a distinction between those people that it's directed to, and other people who might come across an utterance. And so with that in mind, I then want to think about what we mean by imagined, and who is doing this imagining, if there is an imagined audience, as the media studies literature kind of suggests. And for the media studies literature, the imagined audience, it's the communicators who are doing the imagining. They're imagining an audience. So what does it mean to imagine an audience? I always tell my students to avoid dictionary definitions, but I'm going to start by using one here. So if you look in the Cambridge Dictionary, they define imagine as to form or have a mental picture or idea of something. And if we go to the other side of the Atlantic, in the Merriam-Webster, to form a mental image of something not present. So in this sense, if we take these definitions, then yes, of course, the addressees are imagined. The communicator has to have a mental picture of who she's talking to. She has to think about what they know, what they think, what assumptions they hold, what their cognitive environment is like, in order to construct her message. But surely this would apply to all communication, wouldn't it? We have to, even if we know the person we're speaking to, we still have to form a mental image of what's going on inside their cognitive environment in order to construct our message. And Karen Lewis, who's a philosopher who particularly thinks about online communication, she makes this very point. She says, we could think of the imagined audience as operative in all communicative situations, including face-to-face conversations. There's always a way in which a speaker is conceptualizing their audience. There's always some aspect of kind of guesswork involved, and sometimes that's wrong. Sometimes we think someone has an assumption they don't have, and miscommunication happens. However, the fact that this notion of an imagined audience has emerged when talking about these kind of media and social media contexts suggests that there's something different to explain. There's something about those discourse contexts which is different to communicating face to face to somebody. So when we have someone in front of us, when we know them and we know who is processing the utterance, yes, we're still imagining what's going on in their minds, but at least we know whose mind we're trying to connect with. We know whose mind we're trying to imagine. And we're probably going to have some kind of evidence for the assumptions that we make about their assumptions. Maybe we have some pretty good evidence for that. In online contexts, particularly, we may not know who is going to process our utterance, or even when they're going to process it. They may come across it as the second we post it, they may come across it in 5 years' time. And imagine, this word imagine, I think if it's going to apply to everything, then it kind of seems to it seems to imply that the communicator is trying to guess who the set of people is. It kind of implies that the set of addressees is kind of given or fixed, and that what communicators are doing is they're trying to work out who that fixed group is, form a mental picture of them, imagine them, and then fit their utterances to that picture. And this, I think, is the wrong way to think about it. So I think this idea of imagining kind of sets us off on the wrong path. Again, maybe this is just semantics. In these contexts, I think communicators aren't trying to form a mental picture of something. They're creating that something. They're creating a set of addressees via their communicative intentions. And if we kind of go back to relevance theory to kind of argue why I think this is the case. So I'm going to draw on a few brief comments that were made by Dan Sperber and Deirdre Wilson in their original presentation of relevance. So there's a short passage, it's a very well thumbed page on my copy of the book. There's a short passage in the original book where I think about this idea of relevance when there are no definite addressees. So they're talking about broadcast communication, obviously before the days of online communication, but I think the same would apply. And they give us they give us a couple of definitions of how this will work, and they say, particularly, they say the addressees of an act of ostensive communication are the individuals whose cognitive environment the communicator is trying to modify. And I think this is a really key point that's maybe overlooked slightly in some of the some of the discussions we have of relevance theory. The addressees of an ostensive act of communication are the individuals whose cognitive environment the communicator is trying to modify. So notice here that everything here comes from the intention. It comes from the intention who the speaker or the communicator is trying, whose cognitive environment she's trying to modify. She has an intention when she communicates to modify the cognitive environments of certain individuals or certain groups. So they're not imagined in that sense of they exist and I'm trying to guess who they are. They're intended. They are that group is kind of created through the speaker's intentions. And these may not be named people, they may not be definite individuals, they may be types of people or groups of people or people who hold certain assumptions or people who are interested in certain things. So for example, in this discussion of broadcast communication, Sperber and Wilson suggest that when they're writing that particular paragraph in their book, they're addressing their utterances to all individuals who have read the book so far and found it relevant to them. So these are their addressees. Those are the individuals whose cognitive environment they are trying to modify at that particular point. So they're not imagined in the sense of guessing who they are. They're an identifiable or at least a defined group of people. Now, of course, it's true that anybody could read the utterances. Someone could pick up the book in a bookshop and just read that section. And the communicator is not necessarily going to know who's going to do that, when they're going to do it. But that doesn't really matter because those people are the audience. They're not the addressees. What matters is when an individual processes that utterance, whether they fall into the set of individuals whose cognitive environment the communicator is trying to modify. And this doesn't feel like imagining to me, it feels more like cognitively constructing their audience. So the audience, so let's say you're watching this presentation at home and somebody from your family or a friend walks past behind you and hears me talking. That person is still kind of part of the audience. They're hearing my words and maybe they can process the words and the sentences, but I'm not specifically addressing them. They can't expect my utterance to be optimally relevant to them. I'm not trying to modify their cognitive environments. I'm trying to modify the cognitive environments of people who have maybe chosen to come to this talk, and I've prepared my talk on the basis of the assumptions that those type people are going to have. Okay, so what does this mean for the interpretation process in these kind of cases? So I see an online utterance. I recognize that online utterance is an ostensive stimulus. And therefore, I'm going to presume that the communicator was aiming to make it optimally relevant for the addressees. And remember, that those addressees are the individuals whose cognitive environments the communicator is trying to modify. So what do I have to do as a member of the audience? Well, first of all, I have to imagine the set of individuals whose cognitive environment the writer is trying to modify. I have to do that imagining. I have to imagine whose cognitive environment, who is she trying to reach? And then I have to determine whether I'm a member of this set or not. Um, and if I am a member of that set, then I can presume optimal relevance and my interpretation will proceed accordingly. But if I'm not, then I can't make that presumption, and I may still be able to interpret the utterance. I can understand the words. I might get some relevance out of it, but I can't expect relevance. I can't presume optimal relevance. I can't process the utterance with an assumption of optimal relevance. Rather, I'm an eavesdropper on this particular piece of communication. So in the last few minutes, I'm just going to run through 3 quick examples where that I hope will illustrate 3 different scenarios that we might find ourselves in when we're interpreting these kind of utterances. I'm not saying this is an exhaustive list. It's just 3 examples to illustrate the kind of differences we might get. So in the first example, we might come across and there might be an utterance where we are a member of the audience, but we're also an addressee of that particular utterance. So we imagine who the addressee is, and we identify ourselves as one of those addressees. So this is a headline that appeared on my Google Discovery feed. I didn't go looking for this. It popped up on a search engine when I opened my phone one day to search for something. And it says, shoppers won't be able to use paper cash at Tesco, Asda and Aldi after September. Okay, so how does interpretation proceed in this instance? Well, the first thing I do is I imagine the set of individuals who are being addressed, those individuals that I think the communicator is, whose cognitive environments that communicator is trying to modify. And I think this is perhaps people who use UK supermarkets. I consider myself to be a member of this set. I use UK supermarkets. So I interpret the utterance as an addressee and I presume optimal relevance. And of course, I interpret this utterance allowing, as always, for the communicator's abilities and preferences. And in this case, it's going to include the fact that the audience that I'm imagining is, or that I'm imagining that the speaker is directing their utterance to, the communicator, is a very wide, disparate, diverse group. So I can't expect it to be very specific to me, because this audience that I'm imagining is broad and diverse. It's everybody who's ever used or might use UK supermarkets in the near future. So that's the first example. The second example, so here is an example where we have a non-addressed audience member processing an utterance. So this is from an Instagram reel, which I believe was also used as an advert on YouTube, and it was a video. So this was from a celebrity account. So Oti Mabuse, who's a dancer and celebrity in the UK and elsewhere, she has some kind of brand partnership with Sanex shower gel company. And the first line of the video that one of the videos she posted on her account advertising this product was the following: as a new mom, nobody told me how much my shower routine would change after having a baby. So again, I recognize that this is a sensitive stimulus. I assume the communicator was aiming for optimal relevance for the addressees. And I imagine who those addressees are, the set of individuals who are being addressed. It seems reasonable to me that this is going to be new mums, or people who've recently been new mums, or are looking to buy a present for a new mum, or something along those lines. I do not fall into this category. I do not consider myself to be a member of this set. So while I can interpret the utterance, I can't presume it will be optimally relevant to me. I do, however, know enough about that group of individuals, and I can imagine them in enough detail that I can interpret the utterance in a way that I think is probably fairly accurate. So my imagining of that set of addressees is detailed and accurate enough that I can form a hypothesis about the intended interpretation that I'm fairly confident about. And then my final example is a case where the hero, the audience member, I should say, is unable to even imagine the addressees, and really interpretation kind of grinds to a halt fairly quickly. Um, so this is a tweet. I've adapted this tweet slightly to keep it anonymous, but I saw this on Twitter around 2022, and it was about the time of a soccer cup final in Spain between Sevilla and Porto. And it said the following: doubt there will be many happy bears after the final. Now, again, I recognize this as an ostensive stimulus. I assume it's going to be optimally relevant for the addressees. But in this case, I don't really know who those addressees are, at least not in any detail. I can only imagine them in pretty vague terms. So I know, because of the pictures and the hashtags that were included, that this is probably aimed at fans of those particular soccer clubs. Maybe it's aimed at people who are into Spanish or Portuguese football. But if I came across this in isolation, I might not even know that. So depending on the contextual information available to me, I might have an idea of who this is being communicated to, but I quickly realize that I'm certainly not amongst that set. And in fact, I can't even really imagine them in much detail. I can't do it with any confidence. I try to imagine that set of individuals, I can't do so. So I'm unable to form a hypothesis about the intended interpretation of this utterance. I can understand each of the words. I can, I can see that it's a mainly grammatical sentence, but I can't really understand what the intended message is, because I can't imagine the set of addressees in any detail and the assumptions they hold and so on. So I'm likely to abandon my search and scroll on. So this is what I meant at the beginning when I said I don't think the communicator is imagining her audience. I think she's creating a cognitive set of addressees. Imagining does play a part, but from the perspective of the hearer. And so to sum up my last slide, from a pragmatics perspective, the so-called imagined audience is neither imagined nor an audience in any kind of interesting way. Communicators in online discourse contexts do imagine their audience, do not imagine their audience. Rather, they produce utterances that are addressed to those individuals whose cognitive environments they hope to modify. And they probably have a fairly clear idea of that. While we may describe sets of addressees using descriptive shorthand, so we may talk about new mothers, UK shoppers, Sevilla soccer fans, they're really better defined in terms of their cognitive environments and the communicator's intentions. And imagining an audience does play a part in online communication and those other broadcast contexts, but it's something that members of an audience do rather than something that communicators do. That's my starting point for the rest of my research project. Those are my references, and I will stop there.
Perfect. Thank you, Kate. So before the whole floor is open to questions, I would want to ask my question. Because
Go
I've
for it.
so hearing these, I mean it's great, like it's also what I've been thinking about, because I work on stories, and written stories are very difficult in this regard. So I was thinking of cases of dog whistling. So in cases of political dog whistling, the
Mm-hmm.
politician makes a speech, but they seem to have two set of addressees, right?
Yeah,
So one, they try to modify a cognitive environment in a very broad way, whereas
yeah.
for the intended, the real intended audience, so to speak, of the dog whistle, they seem to be trying to kind of aiming to modify that addressee's cognitive environment in a very specific and detailed way. Would that count as a case of imagining an audience in that sense? Or at least like specifically targeting or designing the utterance in this very strategic way?
I mean, it's definitely designed in a very strategic way. I have to think about those specific examples, but I wonder if there's some kind of there's some covert stuff going on there as well, isn't there? I don't want you to realize that I want you to hear this. So there's kind of this it's kind of covert showing, isn't it? Like I know that this other audience is going to see it. So again, the questions around ostension and what role that plays there, and whether that other audience, how they process it, they're going to kind of they kind of realize it's deliberate, I guess, but it's also covert. That's a really interesting example. I'd say this is a tiny bit of a bigger project, and one of the things I definitely want to look at is this idea that we might speak to one audience but show our utterance to a broader audience. And I think the dog whistle is a particularly interesting example, which I hadn't thought of before, but I will definitely, yeah, definitely bring into that, particularly with that covert element in there, that manipulative element there. Thank you. So that wasn't really an answer,
Thank you. Yeah,
other
I
than
see. I
very
see a hand.
interesting.
Yeah, thank you. So, Louis, please, yeah, unmute yourself and.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I was just wondering about the shoppers cash at Tesco case.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, I think it can be relevant to virtually anyone living in the UK
Yeah.
with like a network of social relations who might be using cash at supermarkets. In case just one comes across a situation, circumstances where it could be relevant to pass on the information to those persons,
Yeah.
to possibly concerned persons. So it's sort of a message would be relevant to an audience construed as a middleman to pass on the message, and so that's virtually anyone, isn't it? I wonder what you think about that.
I think, I mean, I think that particular example, yeah, has an incredibly diverse and broad intended audience, right? It's not just people who, and that's why we don't want to define it in terms of it. Things, I cut this slide out for time, but what Sperber and Wilson originally said was, if I can get the quote, they said, it is it's relevant for anyone who finds it relevant, really. Or find the actual, where is it? Let me find the original quote. They say, in broadcast communication, a stimulus can even be addressed to whoever finds it relevant. The communicator is then communicating her presumption of relevance to whoever is willing to entertain it, which I think would cover that, right? Is whoever, if that middleman finds it relevant, then it is addressed to them. The problem with just taking those lines in isolation, which it's often, I'm guilty of doing in my previous work, is that it kind of comes out, it sounds circular on the surface, doesn't it, right? Who is the stimulus addressed to? Well, whoever finds it relevant. Who finds it relevant? Whoever it's addressed to. But actually, so it sounds circular on the surface, but if you use that, if you read a bit further on in that passage, and we get to that definition of whoever's cognitive environment you're trying to modify. So in the case of the headline, I mean, it's a journalistic headline. They're trying to modify almost as many people as possible's environments, I would say. It's also interesting that is actually also a quite clear example of clickbait. It's not even true. They weren't taking away cash at those supermarkets. They were no longer accepting £50 notes, I think. And it was very misleading, that headline. So they were clearly trying to make it sound relevant to as many people as possible to get click-throughs. But yeah, you could definitely have those very, very diverse audiences that might include positions like middlemen, or somebody who's thinking of visiting the UK in the next year and might think, do I need to get cash out or not? All sorts of people.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, do we have further questions from the floor? Doesn't seem like. Okay, then. Oh, okay.
Oh,
Stavros,
last minute.
please.
Hi, thanks so much. This was really, really interesting and a lot of food for thought. I just wanted to, I mean, obviously, you know where I stand with this, so yeah, but I'm just wondering, like, wouldn't it sound more plausible that basically, you know, I send out a message and then, like, as Perper was saying, the original, like in the quote that you just made, that whoever finds it relevant, basically, you know, as an audience, because I'm not talk about, I mean, I can understand whether I'm an addressee, it doesn't have to do with whether I'm supposed to be an addressee from the producer's perspective or whatever have you, but if I find relevance in the message, then I immediately become an addressee myself. Let me make this clearer because I know it's a bit confusing. So basically, couldn't we just say that people low-key are looking for relevance everywhere, which is basically the cognitive principle of relevance, right? And that this sort of guides their attention to particular stuff. And then, if I'm not part of the addressee or the audience, then I just quickly disengage, like in the example with the bears, right? So basically, the idea is that something affects me a lot, meaning that I'm going to get a lot of cognitive effects out of it, of positive cognitive effects out of it. Then I will, in a way, think of myself as one of the addressees, but it doesn't really make a difference to the process itself. The process is the same across the board. So basically, I'm looking at an ostensive stimulus. I recognize it as ostensive. I try to make sense of it. And if it's not really relevant to me, I just disengage from the process, rather than me trying to think whether is it directed at me or not directed at me. Am I included in the communicator's sort of like intention or not? Is what I'm thinking. Because I mean, the thing is, I could easily read the Tesco thing, and I might think, oh yeah, we're slowly as a society moving to cashless stuff. Like I could still establish some relevance.
So I mean, no, I think it does matter, and this comes back to, I think, what Tim said in the opening presentation about we can find things relevant even if they're not addressed to us. So yes, I can overhear two people having a conversation on the bus and I might find what they're saying relevant, but I'm not the addressee. I can't. It's the difference between finding something relevant and being able to presume that relevance in your interpretation. That's kind of the distinction I'm interested in. So if you may find a relevance in a stimulus that the original communicator didn't intend.
Yeah.
And that might even go against, what they originally intended. If that newspaper is, I don't know, from a very different political wing and really thinks it should be a cashless society, and you could end up concluding it's worrying that it could be, it could go against their aim. So I think it does matter whether you are part of the intended addressee group or not. But absolutely, we can find relevance in things that aren't addressed to us. Absolutely, and we're looking for it. So I don't think just the fact that we find relevance in something means that we can assume that it's addressed to us or that we are an addressee of it.
Sure. My only concern with this is that I think that it assigns a bit more agency to the hearer than we should accept, in the sense that I'm just going ahead here stuff and I interpret them. Why would I stop and think, is this addressed to me or not addressed to me or what? No, this happens instinctively. So that's my.
Well, I guess this is the thing. I'm working out this interpretation procedure a bit like we have the comprehension procedure. I'm not necessarily claiming that we consciously think this through. Absolutely, it happens instinctively. But we're making that assessment on some level, I think, in order to know whether we. So I'm in the way that we talk about testing hypotheses in order of accessibility. So I'm not intending to say that that's a conscious necessarily.
Okay. Excellent. Okay, thanks. Yeah, that was my only concern. Thank you.
Okay.
Great, thank you. So thank you again to all the presenters, and we will adjourn for 15 minutes apparently, and we'll be back soon for the third panel session. Thank you very much.